Hello everyone, Frans here, game designer at Goals, and today we're going to talk a bit about stats and how they work in the game. And first things first, for a game with a high skill gap, we believe it's absolutely crucial that we are, fully transparent with all the stats in the game and how they work. So that's why we're making this article and video to kind of explain that so that all users have equal knowledge about the systems and the stats that affect gameplay. The way we have tried to design the stats in our game is to tie them to a very specific action in game when possible. So basically trying to avoid any overlap between stats, and for that reason there are also no such things as different body types or traits or things that could potentially overlap with the stats, and we believe that makes comparison between players and their performance a lot easier to understand and evaluate. So for the purpose of keeping this video relatively lightweight, we're only gonna focus on outfield player stats, but if you are interested in goalkeeper stats, those can be found in the article as well, where you can read up exactly on how they affect gameplay. But for the outfielders then, we have 6 different what we call main stats, and those are the stats that you see on the player card. So that is pace, shooting, passing, dribbling, defending, and physicality. And the important thing to know about main stats is that they do not directly affect gameplay, but rather it is the substats under each main stat that have a direct effect on the gameplay. So the number that you see beside the main stat on the player card is basically just a weighted average of the substats under the main stat. So it gives you an idea of generally how good a player is in that area, but if you want to know how good they are at very specific actions, you need to look at the substats. Starting with pace then, we have 2 different substats that affect gameplay. The first one is acceleration, which is a bit self-explanatory, but it affects how quickly your player gains speed when running. And the other substat under pace is sprint speed, which determines the absolute top speed a player can reach. Moving on to shooting then, we have 6 different substats. The first one being attacking IQ, which is basically a stat that affects how well your AI behaves in the attacking state. So how good they are at detecting space to run into, how well they position themselves, and also how quickly they react to threats for incoming passes when receiving the ball. Next up we have finishing, which determines your accuracy when shooting from a close range for all different shot types. We have shot power, which determines the maximum power you can generate for a shot with all different shot types. We have long shots, which is used for long range shots and your accuracy for those. And important to note here is that for mid-range shots, let's say around the edge of the penalty box, we use a combination of the finishing and the long shot stat. So from close range we use finishing, from long range we use long shots, but for the mid range we use a combination of both. We also have penalties, which determines the pulse rate. I don't know if you've played penalties in goals yet, but there is this circle that is pulsating around the ball that you need to try to time. And the higher your stat is, your penalty stat, the slower that circle is going to pulsate. And the penalty stat also affects the maximum dispersion you have for penalties. And last but not least, under the shooting main stat, we have the weak foot stat, which determines your accuracy with your weak foot and also the maximum power you can generate with the weak foot. I should also mention that it also affects dispersion on passes, but it doesn't affect the power on passes. So those were the 6 substats under shooting. Let's move on to passing, where we also have 6 different substats. The first one being the ground pass stat, which affects the maximum speed you can play a ground pass with, and this comes into effect when you have a receiver that is under threat and it's important to play the pass with a lot of speed. So the higher your ground pass stat is, the more speed you can play the ground pass with, and this is also true for driven passes. Then we have the lofted pass stat, which affects the accuracy and the trajectory of lofted passes. We have the through pass stat, which is a little bit different because it affects the maximum angle that a through pass can be played at. So if you envision a scenario where you kind of want to play the ball around the defender, the higher your through pass stat is, the more likely you're going to be able to do that. So you can almost envision like this type of cone in front of the passer, and the higher your stat is, the wider that cone is. For through pass, I should also mention that it affects the maximum dispersion for lofted through passes. So the better your stat is, the lower your dispersion is going to be. We have the crossing stat as well, which is similar to the lofted pass stat. It affects the accuracy and the trajectory of crosses. We have the curve stat, which affects the maximum amount of curve you can generate on passes, shots, and also free kicks. And the last substat under passing is free kicks, which determines the speed of the pulsating circle, so very similar to penalties where you have this timing element, and the better your stat is, essentially the slower the pulse is going to be on that thing. And it also affects the maximum dispersion on free kicks. Moving on to dribbling then, we once again have 6 different substats. The first one is close dribbling, which affects your touch frequency when close dribbling, and it also affects your maximum speed when close dribbling. And when I say close dribbling, I mean dribbling without holding the sprint button. Then we have the sprint dribbling stat, which affects 2 things. The first one is the maximum speed you can achieve on the ball when sprinting, and the other thing is basically how much you can bring in your touch length when you're getting close to opponents. Because if you play the game, you probably noticed that touches are generally longer when you are sprint dribbling in open space compared to when you're starting to get close to an opponent. So that stat affects how much you can shorten your touch length when you are under threat, basically. Then we have the first touch stat, which affects the cooldown after trapping the ball. So basically, the higher the stat is, the shorter the time is going to be between trapping the ball and the touch after that. And it also affects how quickly you can accelerate after a first touch. Then we have the agility stat, which affects 2 things. The first one is how quickly you can decelerate, so slow down basically. And the other thing is how much speed you can maintain while turning. We also have the balance stat, which determines how quickly a player can recover after getting pushed off the ball. And it also determines how much force you can withstand when dribbling. So the higher the balance stat is, the harder it's gonna be to be pushed off the ball, but it's also gonna allow you to recover quickly when you are pushed off the ball. And the last stat under dribbling is skills, and this has different effects based on what skill move it is. So it could affect things like the execution time of the skill move, so how quickly it is performed. It can affect the cooldown, so for example after a heel to heel, the higher your skill stat is, the lower the time is going to be between the exit touch and the next touch. It can also affect the acceleration boosts for skill moves that have those. So for example, for step overs, the higher your skill stat is, the more of an acceleration boost you get after the exit. So that was dribbling. Now we move on to defending, where the first substat is defensive IQ, which is kind of the counterpart to attacking IQ. So this determines how well your AI players behave in a defensive state. So that is how well they are positioning themselves, how good they are at tracking runs, and how good they are at marking. Then we have the stand tackle stat, which affects your maximum stand tackle lunge distance, so how far you can reach with a stand tackle, but also the maximum angle at which you get assistance when stand tackling. So basically, the higher your stat is, the earlier the assistance is going to kick in if you're rotated away from the ball. Slide tackle is very similar. It affects your maximum slide distance, and similar to the stand tackle, it also affects the maximum angle where you get directional assistance on the tackle. We have the jockeying stat, which affects your maximum speed when you are in the jockey state or in the sprint jockey state. We have interceptions, which determines your reaction time to passes basically. So the higher the stat is, the lower the reaction time of the player is going to be, which will help them intercept more passes. And the other thing is that it also affects their maximum range for what we call a stretch interception. So basically when the player has to reach out a little bit to reach the ball, and the higher the stat is, the further they can reach. The last substat under defending is blocking, and this determines the maximum block radius a player has when trying to block a shot or a pass, and it also affects the growth rate of the block radius. So basically, if you envision a shot being taken, the initial block radius is going to be very small, but then once the player gets more time to react, it's going to expand, and the higher the stat is, the quicker that block radius is expanding. So that was defending. Now we move on to physicality, which is the last main stat to cover, which consists of 5 different substats. The first one is jumping, and that determines the jumping reach of a player, so basically how high they can jump. One thing to mention here though is that if you want to get an idea of the total height reach, you also need to factor in the height of the player. So basically the total height reach is the jumping stat plus the height of the player. Under physicality we also have strength, which is used to determine how much force you can apply in physical duels. And in the case where the strength stat is higher than the balance stat, we also use the strength stat to determine how much force you can withstand on the ball. So that's a little bit of an edge case where we use strength instead of balance if the strength stat is higher on the ball. We also have aggression under physicality, and this determines the reaction time of a player when they are activated for secondary player press. So the higher the stat is, the quicker they're going to react. And it also determines how close to the opponent they can get in the secondary player press state. We have stamina, which is fairly self-explanatory. That determines how quickly a player drains stamina. And the last one is the heading substat, which determines the accuracy and power of headers, both for passing and shooting headers. So that was actually all of the substats in the game. There is one more thing I want to mention before we round things off, and that is the importance of the height of the player in the game. Because as you can envision, you get a benefit of tall players from the height reach they have. And for that reason, it also makes sense that there is some type of drawback to tall players, because otherwise there would be no downside to just using ultra tall players basically. And for that reason, we do have a small agility multiplier based on height. So the taller your player is, the more their agility stat is going to be multiplied down, meaning that they will decelerate and turn a little bit slower compared to a short player, which kind of makes sense from a realistic perspective, but also to balance the benefits of different players in the game. So with that said, we will end the video here. I really hope you guys got some new learnings and insights from this video. And like I mentioned in the beginning, if you're also curious about the goalkeeper stats, you can find all the details about those as well in the article. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Bye bye.